Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that we all agree that financial literacy is important, that financial literacy is a good thing. But that is not the issue at debate today. The question is whether or not this bill is a good response to the question of financial literacy. And I have to say that I have a great deal of doubt about it.
We're certainly supportive of financial literacy. Who would not be? But we are deeply concerned about the lack of information in this bill, and it is my hope that the government will clarify further detail in the course of this debate. We can all agree that increasing the financial literacy of Canadians is an important goal for government, both federal and provincial. A more financially literate population would be a more prosperous population. But financial literacy is not the panacea that the Conservative Party seems to pretend it to be. Far too often over the past 6 years, we've been told by the government that problems like increasing post-secondary education costs and rising household debt can simply be solved by waving this magic wand of financial literacy. This is simply incorrect. There are a number of policy levers the government can operate to help solve the issues of rising household debt or runaway student debt, and increased financial literacy is one of them. My goal is not to downplay the importance of financial literacy, but only to point out that it is not the only policy solution available to the government. But let me turn now, Mr. Speaker, to the contents of the bill. I get the distinct impression that this bill, C-28, was written on the back of an envelope, that the primary motive was probably to have a, quote, announceable for Financial Literacy Month last December, because it is virtually content-free, as I will explain. The bill and its supporting documents are completely devoid of any detail as to how the Office of the Financial Literacy Leader would even work. The bill doesn't specify if there will even be an Office of the Financial Literacy Leader, or if he or she will simply be one more employee at FCAC. Bill C-28 was a response to the recommendations of the Financial Literacy Task Force. The task force was created as part of the 2009 budget and reported back to the Minister early last year. And the task force had 30 recommendations, and this bill satisfies only a part of one of the 30 recommendations. The first recommendation was that the government creates the position of financial literacy leader and that this person be charged with improving financial literacy across Canada. They also said the financial literacy leader should report directly to the Minister of Finance. Under this legislation, this position reports to the Commissioner of FCAC. So let's give them half a point for getting recommendation 1 half right. So their total score then is 1/2 of 1 point out of 30. And I think if I were back in my professor days, I do not think that that, Mr. Speaker, would be a passing grade. The bill also gives FCAC the power to impose a levy on the banks in order to pay for its efforts in improving financial literacy. But it also gives the Finance Minister the power to spend government money to achieve the same objective. As parliamentarians, we are, yet again, being asked to vote on a bill that causes the government to incur costs, spend money, and perhaps tax banks without being given even a hint of the numbers involved. Liberals, and indeed all parliamentarians, shouldn't have a problem with spending resources to improve financial literacy. However, we do want to know what order of magnitude these expenditures would be and the related taxes. Are we talking about $100,000, $500,000, $1 million, $10 million? We have no idea, because there is nothing in this bill to tell us what this process involves other than this naming of this one person. The question of how much things will cost is important because many of the other recommendations from the task force's report do require some additional effort and financial commitment on the part of the government. For example, Recommendation 2 requires the government to establish an advisory board on financial literacy. The advisory board would help the financial literacy leader to develop a national strategy on financial literacy. Recommendation 4 requires a national strategy to incorporate financial literacy in the school curriculums across Canada and at all levels of education. This will obviously require coordination with provincial governments, and may I suggest the direct ministerial mandate asked for in the task force first recommendation. Recommendation 9 suggests that financial literacy material be delivered to Canadians through programs that reach Canadians directly, such as EICPP, OAS, or the Universal Child Care Benefit. There are many such requirements, and they will all cost money. And surely the government must have some idea of the anticipated costs, but there's no mention of any of these recommendations or any actions to be taken or not to be taken in this bill, so that we are all left totally in the dark as to what, if anything significant, this leader would accomplish, how much money it would cost, and what would be the scope of the mandate. So this isn't the first time that the House of Commons has been asked on legislation without knowing the cost. The most prominent case that comes to mind is C-10, the Tough on Crime compendium of bills, where they don't tell us how much will be the additional cost for new prisons. We know from the parliamentary budget officer that it's many billions of dollars. We know that some of those billions will be downloaded onto the provinces, but the government didn't come clean on that. And that was a far more important case, Mr. Speaker, in terms of expenditure of funds than this will be. But it's the same principle. They want us to pass legislation telling us nothing about what it would actually do and what it would actually cost. This similar issue has caught the attention of the Government Operations Committee, which is currently conducting a study on how Parliament considers supply and, more broadly, how we, as parliamentarians, are presented with information on the government spending plans. I would certainly suggest that not knowing the costs of bills before we vote on them is just one part of this problem. But back to the contents of the bill. There are other already existing mechanisms at the disposal of the federal government to promote financial literacy. For example, the Canadian Foundation for Economic Education was created in 1974 as a non-profit, non-partisan organization with the goal of promoting greater financial literacy. They already have tremendous buy-in from government and from the private sector. A quick scan of their website indicates that their list of board of directors includes prominent members of the private, post-secondary, and labour sectors. On the government side, the CFEE has relationships with the Federal Department of Finance and numerous ministries of education provincially. So I know this group, Mr. Speaker, from my earlier incarnation when I was with the Royal Bank as their chief economist. I had several meetings with this group, and I know that they were working diligently, and it certainly isn't obvious from this bill, which tells us virtually nothing, why the addition of one more body in the bowels of the federal bureaucracy will improve financial literacy more than the work being carried out by the Canadian Foundation for Economic Education. In the end, Mr. Speaker, this is an issue I have with this bill. We simply do not know what the government's planning to do. We do know that it may involve taxing banks. We know that it may involve spending more government funds, but we have no idea how much. We do not know the size of this new organization. We do not know which of the other recommendations from the Financial Literacy Task Force will be carried out. We know very little. We know virtually nothing. As I said at the outset, Mr. Speaker, improving financial literacy is an important task for the federal government. We have concerns on this side of the House that the newly created financial literacy leader will not be able to carry out his important task. But, Mr. Speaker, there's another side of this coin. We can talk about the need for greater financial literacy on the part of Canadians. We can also talk about the problem of financial illiteracy on the part of this Conservative government. And I'd like to say a few words on the financial illiteracy of the Conservative government, because I think if there needs to be a course in financial literacy, I think the first ones to enroll in such a course should probably be the members sitting opposite. And let me give you my first example of conservative financial illiteracy. Way back in 2006, prior to the arrival of this government in 2006, for many years, Canadians had to have at least a 5% down payment on a mortgage, and the longest mortgage they could get was 25 years. Well, what did these financial wizards do in 2006, Mr. Speaker? Instead of a 25-year maximum period, they made it 40 years. And instead of having a 5% minimum down payment, they made it 0. Brilliant. Magic. You could get 0 down payment, mortgage for 40 years under this conservative government. Now, the problem is that this is like the subprime mortgages in the U.S. So eventually they found out, they realized, they admitted, no, they didn't admit, they never admit they made a mistake, but they discovered they'd made a mistake. So they put it back from 40 years down to 35, and they brought the minimum payment up from 0 to 5, and then they claimed credit for tightening the system. But the system's not back to where it was when the Conservatives arrived. It's still looser. And so that's the first example of financial illiteracy. Donc je suggère que le ministre.
Therefore, I suggest that the Minister of Finance and some of his colleagues could sign up for Financial Literacy 101, and perhaps if they do that, they'll be able to improve their performance.
The second example of financial literacy is the fact that these Conservatives were so lucky, they inherited a massive $13 billion liberal surplus when they came to power. And then what did they do? They proceeded to spend like drunken sailors, biggest spenders in Canadian history, to the point where these Conservatives actually ate through all that surplus and went into deficit before the recession began. So that's a second reason for the finance minister to enroll in a course which I shall call Financial Literacy 101. It is important to have a prudent fiscal policy. It is not good financial literacy to blow through the $13 billion surplus by spending madly when the economy is strong. Yes, one might have a deficit when the economy is weak, but you don't run through your surplus when times are good with massive spending just before a recession begins. Et j'ai un troisième exemple.
And I have a third example of the lack of financial literacy on the part of this government, and that is their plan to cut government spending in a massive way at a time when the Canadian economy is so fragile. What they're suggesting that they'll do is to cut something in the order of $4 to $8 billion in terms of public spending, to reduce services offered by the government to Canadians, and they are going to do that at a time when the economy is already weak. Don't forget that the unemployment rate is high, that there's a crisis in Europe. Let us not forget that the American economy is weak at this point as well. So we're living in a world where the unemployment rate remains high and the level of risk around the world is very high compared to the past.
Hugely fragile, weak economy. Anyone who went through Financial Literacy 101 would know that this is not the moment to have massive cuts in government spending, massive layoffs of public servants, massive reductions in the services provided to Canadians. It's not a good idea. And you don't have to just believe me. I will invoke the name of Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, and the IMF is the mother of all fiscally prudent people. Typically, IMF calls for countries to cut. So what did Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, say recently? She said that countries which have room, that might not include Greece, but it certainly includes Canada, should, in the short run, focus on measures to create jobs and support the economy, and in the medium term, have a credible plan to balance the books and bring down debt. That's not me talking. That's the head of the IMF. And the chief economist of BMO has said something similar, that making massive cuts at this time is as crazy as what Herbert Hoover did in the U.S. during the Great Depression. So I think that, as I said earlier, that members of this government, maybe even the Prime Minister, would like to enroll in this course which we could set up called Financial Literacy 101. Et s'ils font cela, je pense qu'ils auront.
And if they do that, I think there will be at least 3 topics. The first will be that it's not a wise thing to have 40-year mortgages owing 0 from the outset. That just doesn't make any sense. We've seen that in the States. And the government is changing the system in the wrong direction. Second, it is not prudent from a financial perspective. It is not a sign of financial literacy when you inherit a surplus of over $3 billion and you spend it all when the economy is strong and you go into a deficit even before the recession starts. And that's what this government did, this Conservative government. And that was not a demonstration of good financial literacy. And finally, as I stated, it is not a good idea to do massive cuts in government investments and to incur monumental losses in the public service when the economy is weak and when the world economic system is fragile. That also is not wise.
Say, as I said earlier, in terms of the mark that this bill deserves, they got one of the recommendations out of 30 half right, so that's 1/2 out of 30. That's a failure. And in terms of these 3 subjects for a financial literacy class 101, which I recommend for the government, they fail on all 3. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I always listen with attention and sometimes amusement to my friend across the way who has a self-exalted position of being the financial guru of the Western world. You know, it's easy, Mr. Speaker, to run a surplus when you have unlimited powers of confiscation and taxation.
That's right.
I'll remind the honourable member that they're bragging about the $13 billion surplus. Well, I might remind him that was courtesy of $60 billion confiscated from pension funds, public service, RCMP, Canadian Forces.
That's right.
Another $50 billion confiscated from the EI fund.
Absolutely.
It doesn't take a financial genius to run a surplus, Mr. Speaker, when you've got that kind of power. I might ask the honourable member if he has understood or listened to any of the people around the world who, when they talk about Canada, their main comment when they talk about the economy and the strength of the Canadian economy and unemployment situation, employment situation, is that you know, they wish to goodness that they were in fact Canada. So I know we can never come up to the honourable members' self-exalted standards, but will he admit that you know, financial literacy is important, that any step in that direction is valuable, whether it comes up to his marvellous standards or not?
Honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I consider myself a relatively modest person, not claiming exalted status. But in response to this question, may I remind the member that the 2 main reasons for Canada's relatively strong position are both thanks to the Liberal government of Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien. Because when we came to power in '93, we inherited a $42 billion conservative deficit, and that was much bigger in relative terms in those days than it would be today. And we got rid of that deficit pretty fast. We paid down debt, and that's why, instead of inheriting a $43 billion deficit from us, as we did, they inherited a $13 billion surplus, and then they blew it. And second, we saved the banks because we refused to deregulate, and those guys over there wanted to go all the way to bank deregulation, and that would have been a disaster.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable The honourable member for York South Weston.
I thank my colleague for his comments, and I too note that the one piece of the financial literacy report that is in this, and as you say, it's a half a piece, is the appointment of yet another civil servant to overlook something. We're not exactly sure what, except to collaborate and commiserate with, not commiserate, collaborate and coordinate their activities with unknown stakeholders. And I'm wondering if the fact that there were so many other recommendations that apparently have been completely ignored by this government, which have to do with financial literacy, which have to do with training people, which have to do with actually including financial literacy in school programs, which have to do with actually including financial literacy as a skill that is required of the federal government. What does the member say to all of the things that are missing from this legislation that make it very difficult for anybody to support it if this is all we're going to get?
Honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Well, I thank my colleague for that question, and I certainly agree with the spirit of what he is saying. The only way I can explain a bill that contains virtually nothing is that they did it at the last minute. I mean, maybe they said, oh, next month is Financial Literacy Month. We better have an announceable. Let's make a bill. So they put in a bill, and all they do is they say they'll name one person who will report not to the minister, as the commission suggested, but to somebody else. And they have nothing on the 29 recommendations, many of which make a whole lot of sense. So we are left knowing essentially nothing about whether this person in this job would actually carry out those recommendations or not, or whether, as I said earlier, they would spend $1 million or $100 million or $100,000. We know virtually nothing, and I can only conclude that this bill must have been written on the back of an envelope to prepare for an announceable in Financial Literacy Week.
Comments? The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I enjoyed my colleague's remarks and the facts that he laid out, and how he tried to indicate that maybe the finance minister should take a financial literacy 101 because he is the biggest spending finance minister, the biggest deficit in Canadian history, more wasted money on. During the last couple of years, everything from gazebos to you name it. No open tendering in terms of the F-35. And Mr. Speaker, F-35s, the list goes on and on and on. So I agree with him on that comment. But really, my question to the member, Mr. Speaker, is this just another bill of smoke and mirrors, which we see so often from this government, where they try to allege that they're really doing something when they're really, in effect, doing nothing? I mean, one thing they are doing clear when you read the bill is, yes, they're appointing another person. We have several boards with patronage appointments where the appointees are virtually doing nothing but spending money. And so my question is this just really another bill in which the government will try to message that they're doing something when they're really not?
The honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Well, I thank my colleague for his very wise and astute question, and also his very convincing preamble. I think there's a risk that he is right, that this person, we might just be creating yet another empty office. Do you remember there were other cases where new jobs were created, they were never filled, so we have the taxpayers spending millions of dollars on an office that is empty and that doesn't do anything? I think that there is a risk of this, especially when we are told nothing about the mission, the parameters around this thing, the number of employees. There's a real risk that this is a government trying to create the impression of activity using at least some taxpayers' money and actually potentially creating nothing.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Cooperation.
Mr. Speaker, I think we could spend the afternoon poking accusations across the floor. $40 million that is still unaccounted for under Liberal budgets. I'm sure Canadians would like to know that. But really, I'd like to get back to the essence of what this legislation is trying to do. I have 2 daughters, both successful young ladies. My hope is that they will be financially successful and understand the mechanisms that are available to them to make wise choices with their money, to be educated about those opportunities, and to have the opportunity to invest their money to create their own futures. So because much of what my colleague was saying earlier rests with the provinces because of education being, or curriculum for schooling be a provincial responsibility, I wonder if he has any suggestions for the government how we might work with those partners to ensure that the financial portion of the education could be included in perhaps high school educations or college educations. Does he have any suggestions for the government to work on?
The honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for her questions. I think the first thing to say in relation to your earlier comments about your daughters, that of course we on this side agree that financial literacy is very important, not only for your daughters, but for my children, for all Canadians, and that there is a lack of it, there is a need for more. Our question is not that. Our question is whether this bill will make any difference, or whether the existing agencies that I described in my speech are doing a job and we might just have duplication here and that might not make the situation net any better, or since the bill doesn't tell us anything about how many people or what the mandate would be, it's unclear to me what the answer should be. I mean, I think working with provincial governments to improve financial literacy, including in areas of provincial jurisdiction, through some sort of national committee, might be a good idea. But that side is the government. There's no statement in there as to whether that is involved or not. Its absence suggests it's not involved. But I mean, if she's asking me whether in principle a cooperative body but involving different levels of government to address financial literacy in different areas involving both levels of government's jurisdiction is a good idea, yes. But if that's the case, why wasn't it in the bill?
Resuming debate.